Hey everyone, this is Chris from Surreal Seeker Workshops, and this tutorial is going to be about the develop module and the basic processing of an image. We're going to be working with raw files, so hopefully you have been shooting raw. That is the power of Lightroom, and that's what we're going to see here right now. So first things first, we're currently in our library module. We can see all of the photos from this folder. So what I'm going to do is pick the image that I want to work on. It's simple as clicking on it, making sure it's highlighted, and then we can do one of two ways to get to the develop module. We can just click develop, simple enough. We can click back to library, or we can use the hotkeys. Command option number 2. And we're back here. So Lightroom works top down. We're gonna look at these control panels over here. This is where we're gonna be working with today. Basic and the tone curve. Those are the two. But before we get there, I'm just going to show you a couple other panels just so you have a feel for the interface. Starting on the left, this is the navigator. This is going to give you a smaller image of your image, and that you can scroll around through. For example, above here are the zoom and view sizes. As you can see, this is a 1:1, it's 100%. And here we have the option to go in even further. 2:1, 3:1, all the way down to 8:1. I usually leave it at 2 or 3:1, and that's where you can do some really fine processing adjustments. And within the navigator now, we can choose the crosshairs and work within that. So we're going to go back out to the full size, and that is the navigator. That's a nice little window to make sure you're aware of. Next is the histogram, and this is arguably one of the most important things both in shooting and post-processing. A quick summary of the histogram in case you're not familiar. This shows you where your pixels are in the image. For example, it reads left to right. So the blacks are on the left, shadows, and then we work towards the midtones in here. Then we get towards the highlights, and then we get to the white levels. And then what this graph shows us is the more pixels that are in that area, according to the height and width, that's where the amount of information is in your image. For example, this image has a fair amount of pixels in the shadows to low, which is fine, and we have tons of mid-range and nothing really in the highlights, and definitely nothing blown out as it is now. So we can talk more about the histogram in other tutorials, a little more in depth, but that's the general that you need to know. Working down next. So before we start getting into these two panels, our very first step every time, I repeat, every time you process your image, we're going to come all the way down to the bottom. And we're going to look at this panel, which is camera calibration. And you're going to have a pull-down menu here. As you can see, there's a handful of settings. This is the starting bar, if you will, for how to process your image. And it's important to select this first, because if you do it after, all of the adjustments you made will then readjust based on this calibration. So it's a very good habit to always come down here first and pick which template, if you will, that you want to work off of. I suggest playing with your in-camera settings first, because these tend to correlate. If you notice, your camera may have some picture profiles based off of these words. I like to shoot vivid, and a quick note about that, we are shooting raw, and I advise everyone in my workshops also to shoot a JPEG along with it, and that JPEG gets adjusted to your camera profile. And it's something I learned along the way, that it's nice to get it as best as you can in the camera, and that way you have a JPEG reference in the field and when you come back. And that is how I learned to use the vivid setting in my post-processing. It's just how I like to work. So moving on. After you've set your camera calibration, we're going to go back up. And we're going to work in the basic. First thing, you will likely have set your white balance to a value. You'll now see that you can change that value all the way up to some crazy high Kelvin if you like, all the way down to some crazy low stuff. You have a wonderful little pull-down menu here that'll read it as shot, and then you can see these might look just like your in-camera white balance settings also. And this is where we get into the power of a raw file. Nothing has been embedded. You have the ability to change all of those things afterwards, so that whether it's a creative or a technical adjustment, you have the power to do it afterwards. So for this image, we're going to leave it where we shot it, and we're going to move down next to here. So what we have first is the exposure slider. And it might be really easy for you to jump right in and start twisting this knob, if you will. But in general, I like to leave the exposure alone depending on the shot. In this case, we've got a nice balance. We're just going to leave it because exposure is a global adjustment, meaning it's going to change everything, whether it's brighter or darker. So we're going to leave that for a second. And we're also going to leave contrast. What I'm going to show you has some of the most power in Lightroom. This first slider is for highlights. Highlights are the extreme whites of an image. And this slider lets us push them, or in most cases, which I will demonstrate, recover them. So all of a sudden, we have knocked that slider down to the left, and we have regained all kinds of definition in the clouds. The magic of a raw file. Next, shadows does a very similar task. It's a finite adjustment to bring back the detail in dark areas. For example, if we bring this up, you will see the dark areas in here come back to life. Very powerful, and then we can bring it back down. Set that to 0. But we're going to skip that just for this moment, and we're going to go straight to whites, and below that are blacks. Using this slider and this slider lets you basically create an exposure adjustment, but a finer tuned version where that's not global. So now that we've brought the highlights down, you can see the image has gotten kind of dark, and again, that's reflected in our histogram. So we're going to use this slider, or the numbers in this case, to bring the white level up. That's a little better. So we've now told it that that's where the white level begins. And we're going to do similar with the blacks. We're going to bring the blacks up about 10. Let's make that 15. What we're doing too is we're adding some contrast in naturally. And before we get too much further, all of these edits are non-destructive and undoable. For that, we hit Command Z, and it'll tell you what we've undone. To redo that, we would hit Command Shift Z. Or if you like, you can go up to the Edit, and those two keystrokes are also up here. Keystrokes are great. I encourage you to get in the habit of those. We can also go over to our History panel. We haven't touched this yet, but now that we've made some edits, we can click through our history. And you can see we can go back step by step through different edits we've made and either start there again or come back to the top. And we can also pay attention to the navigator window here. As we go down through without clicking, it will show us what adjustments we've made in the navigator window. Now that we have a good idea of where we're headed here, we're going to go down to this subpanel, Presence. Clarity does some amazing things. You can, as you might imagine, it can either add a softness to the image or a sharpness. For my work, I like to bump up the clarity a touch, largely because it gives it a bit better sharpness for printing. So with that said, I do about 20. And you can see how that just lifted up some edges and brought back some detail. But for comparison, I'll show you what it looks like to bump it in the opposite direction. A softer, more dreamlike effect, which for a lot of images is quite nice. But we're going to go back to where I had it. And the next two sliders are arguably my favorite, but should be used in moderation. Vibrance will do just that. It will tell it how vibrant to push the colors. I often keep it at a very stock 10, just a small amount. For example, this is what happens if you go really aggressive with it. And all of a sudden it becomes very Candyland and a bit much. Pretty, but a bit much. So keep that one in moderation. And the same thing goes for saturation, although you can push it, in my opinion, a bit further. More times than not, my images run at about a 20. And as you can see, we brought back a fair bit of saturation. And just to demonstrate, this is what happens if you get too aggressive. Although not as bad as vibrance, it really becomes, again, quite beautiful, but a bit much. And those are global adjustments, meaning they adjust the entire the entire image as far as those adjustments are made. And to show you what it looks like desaturated, all of a sudden you've lost almost all the color, which can work for a lot of things. But so now we've made our rounds through the basic panel, and that was only about 6 or 7 adjustments, all pretty soft and minute in the scheme of things. And what we're going to do now, take note, we've left the shadows. This is my process. You can jump ahead and get in there and adjust the shadows if you like, but I prefer to wait, and you'll see why. So now we're going to come down to the tone curve, and you're going to see 4 sliders, reminiscent of what we've already have been playing with. We've got highlights, lights, darks, and shadows, and these correspond to those pixels, again, aforementioned in the histogram. These are a bit more precise, and it's nice to use them that way. So there's 2 ways you can do it. You can do it based on the sliders here. For example, I'll show you what it looks like to bump up those highlights. A bit of negating the adjustment we made up here. So let's bring that back down. Oops. And we can do the same thing with the lights. As you can see, these sliders have a lot of potential, and I like to use them in a push-pull method. So they do correlate to the adjustments we've made up here, and I like to offset things. So for example, we brought the highlights down up here. So what I would jump to, if you would, is I would bring the highlights back up a smidge because they're a bit more precise in this tone curve. Let's bring them up to 25. So we've lightened up just there, just a touch. And now to play with the lights. Most of my images, I'm usually adjusting for the sky, trying to get back some dynamic range. So what I like to do is complement the highlight adjustment up here by dropping the lights. As you can see, that's without, and that's with the highlights brought back down. So now all of a sudden we've gotten most of this sky is in the range of, in the image. We've got a little bit of brights here, but that's okay. And now we're going to go to the darks. This image probably is going to be most affected by this slider based on the histogram. For example, if we push this up to a 50, we'll say halfway, look how bright that whole thing got. Now if we undo that and bring it down just for comparison, look how dark. So that's a good idea of how many pixels are in that darks area. So for this image, we're going to bring it up just a touch at 15. And then, again, to balance that, we're going to come down to the shadows. And I particularly like dark pixels in my images. I like black. I like being able to see the whole spectrum, and I'm not afraid of shadows. So I will bring those down a touch. So now that we've addressed the last slider on the tone curve, we're going to deal with the lone slider that we left. That's the shadows. But first, I feel like now that we've adjusted the tone curve, we need to do a little compensation, and the overall black level, in my opinion, is too much. So I'm going to bring it all back down to a -10. And as you can see, some of those areas feel a little dark, but that's why we're going to use the shadows slider last, because it's very precise and it's only going to fill, you guessed it, the precise shadow areas. So even though some of these areas are really dark, that's the way I want it. And if you can see, when we undo it, and now redo it, this shadow slider has allowed us to do a precise adjustment. And to do one more small thing, the exposure slider that we skipped right off the bat, now is not a bad time to either give it a 1 or go down. And again, as you can see, this is a global adjustment now. Since we've made all these fine adjustments, we're just going to give it a 0.1, if you will, in positive exposure. So that is how you process your raw file, using only the basic panel and the tone curve. You can skip the tone curve and just do a basic, and it's still going to come out great. I feel that if you learn to use these two in conjunction, it's really the first big step of processing your image, meaning it's pretty much ready to go on a lot of levels out of this stage. And to see what we've done, we can do 2 things. We can go all the way over to here, to our history, and scroll down to when we first brought everything in. And that's the raw. Never Never think that your raw file is the final. It's really just the negative. Think of it as a film negative that you have to process. So then we can go back up to our last edit, and boom. And we can also do another thing. We can create a snapshot by doing Command N. And what that does is in this panel here, it gives us an image, or a saved image, if you will, of what we've done. So you can make a snapshot of how you like it, and then go back to something else, keep editing, and keep tweaking. And our final quick tip of this tutorial is a little bit of how to view this image to get a better feel for it. If you use your keyboard, the letter L will perform a function called lights out. One click brings it to there. Second click brings it to complete black. This is great for viewing just your image and getting a really good look at how well you've done. So thank you guys for hanging around and checking out how to process your files. Make sure to check out Surreal Seeker workshops for upcoming workshops all over the West, and have a good night.